For 10 years, the silver flatbed truck arrived on the first Tuesday of the month. It never brought paying work. It brought garbage. Specifically, shattered experimental engines from Frost Dynamics, dropped at Dean's struggling auto shop without a single word of explanation. The billionaire CEO, Camilla Frost, treated his garage like her personal landfill. Dean swallowed his pride and took the scrap to feed his kid. But 10 years later, Camilla's aerospace empire shattered overnight. And the next thing she dropped off was herself. The smell of Dean Miller's garage was a permanent fixture in his clothes, his hair, and the pores of his skin. It was a heavy, suffocating blend of oxidized iron, burnt 10W30 motor oil, and the sharp, chemical tang of brake cleaner. He scrubbed his hands with pumice soap until the knuckles bled, but the dark crescents under his fingernails never washed out. It was a Tuesday, the first Tuesday of November. Outside, the Ohio sky hung low and gray, spitting a freezing drizzle that turned the potholed asphalt of his lot into a slick, reflective mess. Dean was underneath a rust bucket 94 Chevy truck, fighting a seized exhaust manifold bolt, when he felt the familiar rumble in his chest. It wasn't the rattling idle of a failing transmission. It was the low, guttural purr of a heavy-duty diesel flatbed. He didn't need to roll out from under the chassis to know who it was. The tires crunched over the loose gravel, stopping exactly 10 feet from the open bay door. "Stay in the office, Toby," Dean muttered. From the corner of the shop, sitting on a milk crate and drawing on the back of unpaid invoices, his 8-year-old son didn't look up. Toby just pulled his fleece jacket tighter and kept coloring. Dean pushed his creeper out from under the Chevy. The cold air bit at his sweat-dampened neck. A silver flatbed truck idled in the lot. Directly behind it sat a sleek obsidian black SUV, its tinted windows rolled up tight against the miserable weather. The truck driver, a guy Dean only knew as Mac, stepped out, popped the hydraulics, and let the bed tilt back. With a deafening, metallic screech that made Dean's molars ache, a twisted lump of metal slid off the bed and slammed onto the concrete. The impact sent a spiderweb of cracks through the pavement. It was an engine block, or what was left of one. Searing hot, smelling of melted synthetic polymers and scorched aluminum. It was a prototype aerospace thruster from Frost Dynamics. The casing was blown out. Charred wires hung from it like the guts of a mechanical carcass. Mac hit a button, lowering the flatbed. He didn't ask for a signature. He never did. He just climbed back into the cab and drove away. The black SUV lingered for exactly 30 seconds. Dean could barely make out the silhouette of Camilla Frost in the back seat. She never looked at him. She never rolled down the window. She just sat there in the climate-controlled silence of her leather interior, watching her million-dollar failure smoke on his cheap concrete. Then, the SUV slipped into gear and vanished down the access road. Dean stood there, an oil-stained rag gripped tightly in his fist. His jaw clenched so hard his temples throbbed. 10 years. This exact routine had played out for 10 solid years. Every month, a new catastrophic failure from Camilla Frost's R&D department dumped on his property. It was technically illegal dumping. It was profoundly arrogant. It was a billionaire using a single father's failing transmission shop as a literal trash can because she knew he didn't have the money to sue her. "Is the lady gone?" Toby asked, finally peeking around the doorframe of the office. "Yeah, bud, she's gone," Dean said, his voice dropping its hard edge. Dean walked over to the smoking wreckage. The heat radiating off the metal warmed his freezing shins. He hated Camilla Frost. He hated the sterile, untouchable bubble she lived in. But as he looked down at the mangled block, his mechanic's eye saw the truth beneath the insult. The block was aerospace-grade titanium. The torn heat shields were laced with platinum. The cracked tubing was pure, unalloyed copper. He didn't drag it to the scrapyard today. He couldn't afford to waste the daylight. He grabbed his heavy work gloves, the thick leather stiff and cracked. He picked up his angle grinder. For the next 3 hours, the garage was filled with the blinding shower of orange sparks and the deafening shriek of a cutting wheel biting into aerospace alloy. He worked methodically. bitterly, stripping the engine down to its most valuable components. By nightfall, his back screamed in protest, a dull, throbbing ache radiating down his spine. His forearms were covered in tiny burn marks from the sparks, but sitting in the bed of his pickup were 3 sorted piles of rare metals. Tomorrow, the scrap dealer on the east side would hand him $400 in crumpled 20s. That money would buy Toby's asthma inhalers. It would keep the natural gas turned on so they wouldn't freeze this winter. Dean wiped his face with the back of his wrist, smearing grease across his cheekbone. He looked out into the pitch-black night. He hated the indignity of it. He felt like a scavenger picking meat off the bones of a predator's kill. Camilla Frost didn't dump this here to help him. To her, he wasn't a person. He was a geographic convenience, a void where she could hide her company's expensive mistakes from the shareholders. He walked into the small, dingy office. Toby was asleep, his head resting on his arms over the desk, a faint wheeze in his breathing. Dean gently scooped the boy up, careful not to let his grease-stained overalls touch Toby's face. "Got the rent, kiddo," Dean whispered to the empty room. "Thank the Ice Queen." The empire did not end with an explosion. It ended with a quiet, pathetic whimper on AM radio. It was a sweltering Tuesday in July, 10 years almost to the day since the first engine shattered Dean's concrete. The heat inside the garage was thick, pressing down like a wet wool blanket. The air smelled of stale sweat and evaporating gasoline. Dean was elbows deep in the engine bay of a dying Honda Civic, trying to unthread a stripped spark plug without cracking the cylinder head. The radio on his workbench was tuned to a local news station, playing low under the hum of the oscillating fan. Trading halted this morning for Frost Dynamics. Federal agents have reportedly secured the corporate headquarters following allegations of massive defense contract fraud and the falsification of safety data. Sources say CEO Camilla Frost has been ousted by the board. Dean stopped turning the wrench. The sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. He blinked it away, wiping his face with a dirty sleeve. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. He had spent a decade harboring a quiet, simmering resentment toward that black SUV. He had imagined 100 scenarios where he finally saved up enough money to hire a lawyer, or where he loaded a flatbed himself and dumped all her garbage right on her manicured front lawn. Now, the federal government had done it for him. The untouchable billionaire was ruined. He waited for the rush of vindication. He waited to feel a triumphant grin split his face. It didn't come. Dean just stared at the stripped spark plug. The empire was dead, he thought, and I still need a 10mm socket. He went back to work. 3 weeks passed. The first Tuesday of August came and went. For the first time in 10 years, the silver flatbed did not appear. The silence in the lot felt heavy. Dean wouldn't admit it out loud, but he felt the pinch. That scrap money was reliable. Now he was short on the property tax installment. It was late Thursday afternoon when the sky tore open. A sudden, violent Midwestern thunderstorm plunged the city into premature darkness. Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof of the garage with a deafening roar. Water sheets poured down the open bay doors, flooding the drain in the center of the floor. Dean was sweeping the rainwater out with a heavy push broom, his boots soaked through, when a pair of headlights cut through the gray curtain of rain. It wasn't a sleek black SUV. It was a battered yellow city taxi. The cab pulled up to the edge of the open bay. The back door opened. A figure stepped out into the absolute deluge. The taxi didn't wait. The driver slammed it into gear and peeled out, splashing a wave of muddy water onto the person's shins. Dean stopped sweeping. He leaned on the wooden handle of the broom, his eyes narrowing in the dim light. It was Camilla Frost. She stood at the edge of the concrete, rain plastering her dark hair to her skull. She wasn't wearing a designer suit. She wore an oversized, cheap gray trench coat that was already soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. She was clutching a damp cardboard banker's box to her chest, her knuckles bone white. She looked small, frail, stripped of the imposing aura that wealth and power had always projected for her. The smell of wet asphalt and ozone filled the air between them. Water dripped from her chin. Her makeup was entirely washed away, revealing pale skin and deep, bruised hollows under her eyes. She stared at Dean. Dean stared back. He didn't move to invite her in. The anger he thought had dissipated flared up in his chest, hot and sharp. 10 years she treated him like dirt, and now she was standing on his property. Slowly, she took a step into the garage, out of the rain. Her cheap shoes squelched against the concrete. She shivered violently, her teeth audibly clicking together. She looked around the shop. Her eyes scanned the rusted tools, the oil stains, the half-disassembled cars. Finally, her gaze landed on the far corner of the shop. Stacked against the brick wall were pieces of the last engine she had dumped, a scorched manifold and a heavy block of titanium he hadn't had the time to cut up yet. "You kept them," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken, as if she hadn't spoken in days. It lacked the commanding edge he had always imagined she possessed. "I scrapped them," Dean said, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. "At $15 a pound to feed my kid. Did you think I was building a shrine?" She flinched at the harshness of his tone, but she didn't look away. The cardboard box in her arms was rapidly losing its structural integrity. The bottom was bowing out, wet paper peeling away. She started, her breath hitching. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "The bank took the house. They took the accounts. My lawyer isn't returning my calls." "Sounds like a rough week," Dean said, not moving from his broom. "What do you want me to do about it? Change your oil?" "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice cracking entirely. A single tear, indistinguishable from the rainwater, cut through the grime on her cheek. "For 10 years, this is the only place I knew that took broken things." The bottom of her soggy cardboard box finally gave out. With a wet rip, the contents spilled onto the greasy floor. A few framed photos, a broken coffee mug, some crumpled legal papers, and a gold watch. That was it. The sum total of Camilla Frost's remaining existence, scattered in the oil drippings of a '94 Chevy. Dean looked at the mess. He looked at the trembling, ruined woman standing in his garage. His hands tightened on the broom handle until his knuckles ached. He wanted to tell her to get out. He wanted to yell. But as he looked at her shivering in her wet coat, smelling of cheap wool and absolute defeat, the cynicism drained out of him, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. "Pick up your stuff," Dean said quietly, turning away to grab a clean rag from the workbench, "before it soaks up the brake fluid." Camilla dropped to her knees. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look for a clean spot on the concrete. She just collapsed downward, her wet trench coat soaking up a fresh puddle of antifreeze and transmission fluid. Dean stood perfectly still, the shop rag hanging from his fingers. He watched her pale, manicured hands scramble over the gritty floor, desperately grasping at the soggy, ruined papers. Her fingers brushed against a thick glob of black axle grease. She didn't flinch. She just kept gathering the mess, pressing the damp documents against her chest, smearing the grease directly onto her white blouse. The silence in the garage was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the tin roof and the harsh, ragged sound of her breathing. It was pathetic. It was the most pathetic thing Dean had ever seen. For 10 years, this woman had been a phantom behind tinted glass, a corporate titan who commanded thousands of employees, signed billion-dollar government contracts, and treated Dean's livelihood like a dumpster. Now she was kneeling in his dirt, frantically trying to salvage a shattered picture frame. The glass was cracked perfectly down the middle, bisecting a photo of a much younger Camilla standing next to a gray-haired man Dean didn't recognize. "Leave the glass," Dean said. His voice was rough, scraping against his own throat. "You're going to cut yourself." She didn't listen. She picked up the broken frame, her hands trembling so violently that the shards rattled against the metal backing. Dean exhaled a long, heavy breath. He tossed the clean rag. It landed softly on top of her ruined cardboard box. "Wipe your hands," he ordered. Camilla stopped. She stared at the red shop towel as if she didn't understand what it was. Slowly, she picked it up and dragged it across her palms. It only smeared the grease further, working the dark stain into the creases of her knuckles. She looked up at him, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, water dripping from her eyelashes. The bruising under her eyes looked even darker in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the shop. "I don't have anywhere to go," she repeated. The words were hollow, stripped of any plea for sympathy. It was just a cold, terrifying statement of fact. "My accounts are frozen. The feds took my phone. My driver, he just dropped me here because it was the last address in the GPS history." Dean clenched his jaw. He felt the familiar hot spike of resentment. "So I'm just a default setting," he thought. "A glitch in your navigation system." "Dad?" Dean turned. Toby was standing in the doorway of the office, rubbing his right eye with a small fist. He was wearing his oversized dinosaur pajamas, the fleece worn thin at the knees. He looked from his father to the woman kneeling in the puddle of oil. "Who's that?" Toby asked, his voice thick with sleep. Dean's posture softened instantly. The hard lines around his mouth relaxed. "Just a customer, bud. Car broke down in the rain. Go back to sleep. I'll be in there in a minute." Toby blinked, staring at Camilla for a long moment before shuffling back into the dim office. Camilla watched the boy disappear. For the first time since she stepped out of the taxi, something registered in her eyes besides blind panic. She looked back at Dean, her gaze traveling over his grease-stained overalls, the worn-out boots, the exhaustion etched deep into his features. "Get up," Dean said, turning his back to her. He walked over to the heavy metal rolling door and grabbed the pull chain. With a loud, rattling screech, he hauled the door down, shutting out the storm and sealing the garage. He didn't want to do this. Every survival instinct he had honed over the last decade screamed at him to call a cab, give her a $20 bill, and shove her back out into the rain. She was poison. She was the embodiment of everything that kept guys like him grinding their bones to dust just to survive. But he couldn't leave a dog out in that rain, let alone a human being. He walked to the utility sink in the corner, turning the hot water knob until it groaned. He squirted a heavy dollop of orange pumice soap into his hands and scrubbed them violently, washing away the day's grime. "There's a space heater in the office," Dean said over the sound of the running water. He didn't look at her. "There's an old couch I use when I pull all-nighters. It smells like exhaust, but it's dry. You can stay the night." He heard the squeak of her wet shoes against the concrete. She was standing up. "Why?" she asked. The word was barely a whisper. Dean grabbed a paper towel and dried his hands, wadding it up and throwing it perfectly into a metal trash can. He finally turned to face her. "Because I'm not you," he said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled slightly, her shoulders slumping. She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. She just clutched her ruined belongings against her chest, lowered her head, and walked slowly toward the office door. Dean watched her go. He listened to the squeak of her shoes, the heavy click of the office door shutting behind her. He stood alone in the center of the garage, surrounded by the smell of metal and rain. He looked at the pile of titanium scrap in the corner, her garbage, his paycheck. He walked over to his workbench, grabbed a heavy wrench, and threw it as hard as he could against the brick wall. It hit with a deafening crack, chipping the masonry before clattering to the floor. It didn't make him feel any better. The smell of stale Folgers and burnt toast was the first thing to cut through the thick metallic air of the garage. Dean was up by 5:30. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle, cloudless morning. Sunlight bled through the high, dirty windows of the bay doors, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the cold air. His back ached with a deep, familiar throb. He had spent the night sleeping on a piece of cardboard under a customer's Ford Taurus, a thin moving blanket thrown over his legs. He walked over to the small break station, a rickety folding table holding a stained coffee maker and a toaster from the late 90s. He poured black coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, the dark liquid scalding his throat as he took a sip. The office door opened with a quiet creak. Camilla stood in the doorway. In the unforgiving light of morning, she looked even worse. Her trench coat was draped over a chair inside, leaving her in her wrinkled, ruined white blouse and dark slacks. The grease stain from the night before was smeared across her ribs like a massive bruise. Her dark hair was a tangled, dried mess, and her face was terrifyingly pale. She stood awkwardly, her arms crossed tight over her chest, hugging herself against the morning chill. "Morning," Dean said, his tone flat. He didn't offer her a mug. He picked up a styrofoam cup, filled it to the brim, and set it on the edge of the folding table. Camilla walked over slowly, her eyes darting around the shop. She picked up the cup. Her hands were still shaking slightly. She brought it to her lips and took a sip, grimacing at the bitter, burnt taste. It wasn't the single-origin espresso she was used to. It was survival juice. "Where is your son?" she asked, her voice cracking. "School drop-off," Dean said, pulling a clipboard off the wall. "Neighbor took him. He's got a field trip today." He walked past her, heading toward the pile of aerospace scrap in the corner. He needed to finish cutting the titanium block. The property tax was due tomorrow. He grabbed his heavy leather apron and threw it over his head, pulling the straps tight across his back. Camilla followed him at a distance, holding her styrofoam cup with both hands. She stopped 10 feet away, watching him plug in the heavy angle grinder. Her eyes drifted down to the shattered thruster block. She stared at the scorched metal, the twisted copper tubing, the blown-out heat shields. A strange, unreadable expression passed over her face. For a brief second, the shivering, broken woman vanished, replaced by a ghost of the CEO who had built an empire. "That's a Mark 7, she said quietly. Dean paused, his thumb hovering over the grinder's power switch. He looked at her over his shoulder. "What?" "The thruster," Camilla said, taking a half-step closer. She pointed a pale, grease-stained finger at a specific fracture in the casing. "It's a Mark 7 orbital thruster. It failed during a sustained burn test. The cobalt titanium lattice fractured at 3,000 degrees. Dean stared at her. He looked down at the chunk of metal, then back to her. "I don't care if it's a piece of the space shuttle. It weighs 80 pounds, and the scrapyard gives me a premium for the cobalt." Camilla flinched, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the wreckage. "Do you know how much that piece of metal cost to prototype? Do you know how much a new transmission for a Chevy costs?" Dean fired back, his patience instantly vanishing. He dropped the grinder. It clattered loudly against the concrete. "Because for 10 years you dumped millions of dollars of your failures on my floor. Every month. You didn't ask. You didn't care. You just made your trash my problem." Camilla swallowed hard. She looked down at her cheap, waterlogged shoes. "It was a loophole," she whispered. Environmental disposal fees for experimental alloys were bankrupting the R&D division. My legal team found an obscure zoning ordinance. This property, it's technically zoned as an industrial reclamation site because of the old foundry that used to be here. By dumping it here, it was classified as recycling transfer. It saved the company $4 million a year. Dean felt the blood rush to his ears. A high-pitched ringing started in his head. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The sheer, calculated callousness of it took his breath away. "A loophole," Dean repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You used my home, my business, as a tax shelter for your garbage." Camilla looked up, tears springing to her eyes. "I didn't know you. You were just an address on a spreadsheet, a red pin on a zoning map. I never looked out the window of the car. I swear to God I never looked." "Well, look now," Dean barked, throwing his arms wide, gesturing to the oil stains, the rusting tools, the crumbling brick walls. "Take a good hard look, Camilla. This is the spreadsheet. This is the red pin. I cut my hands to ribbons cutting up your mistakes just so I could buy my kids asthma medicine, while you sat in that black SUV and saved $4 million. She shrank back, her shoulders curling inward. The coffee in her styrofoam cup sloshed over the rim, burning her fingers, but she didn't seem to notice. The reality of the dirt beneath her feet, the smell of the sweat, the sheer weight of the life she had ignored, it was finally crashing down on her. "I'm sorry," she choked out, a raw, ugly sob tearing from her throat. I lost it all. Everything. They took my company. They took my life. Dean stared at her weeping in his garage. He waited for the satisfaction. He waited for the feeling of victory. But looking at the broken billionaire crying over a styrofoam cup, Dean realized something deeply depressing. Her suffering didn't fix his life. Her ruin didn't pay his taxes. Tears don't pay the bills around here, Dean said, picking up the angle grinder again. He pulled his safety goggles over his eyes. You want to stay another night? You earn it. Grab a broom. He hit the power switch. The grinder screamed to life, showering the garage in a blinding arc of orange sparks. The push broom had a heavy ash wood handle, splintered near the base, and smoothed at the top by a decade of calloused palms. Camilla stared at it where Dean had shoved it against the wall. She looked down at her own hands. The manicure was ruined, the pale pink polish chipped, the cuticles stained black with axle grease from her frantic scramble the night before. She had managed a Fortune 500 company. She had negotiated defense contracts in windowless rooms with four-star generals. She had never swept a floor. The angle grinder shrieked behind her, a deafening, high-pitched wail that vibrated right through her jawbone. Dean was completely ignoring her, buried in a shower of brilliant orange sparks as he carved up her company's multi-million-dollar failure. Camilla wrapped her hands around the broom handle. It felt heavy, unwieldy. She pushed it across the uneven concrete. A cloud of fine gray dust plumed into the air, coating the hem of her ruined slacks. She coughed, tasting pulverized metal and ancient dirt. She pushed again. The coarse bristles scraped against the floor, catching on loose washers, zip ties, and hardened blobs of synthetic oil. She didn't know how to corral the mess. She just moved it from one side of the bay to the other, her breathing growing ragged. The humidity in the garage was rising as the morning sun hit the damp tin roof. Sweat beaded on the back of her neck, sliding down her spine beneath the silk of her blouse. 2 hours passed. The grinder finally spun down with a dying whine. Dean pushed his safety goggles up onto his forehead, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He turned and watched her. Camilla had managed to gather a jagged, uneven pile of debris near the center drain. She was leaning heavily on the broom, her chest heaving. The soft flesh at the base of her right thumb was bright red. A blister the size of a dime had already formed, filled with clear fluid, tearing against the rough wood with every push. "You're just stirring it up," Dean said. His voice cut through the ringing silence of the shop. Camilla stiffened. She didn't look at him. She just gritted her teeth and shoved the broom forward again. The blister popped. A sharp, hot sting radiated down her wrist. She gasped, dropping the handle. It clattered loudly against the concrete. She stared at her palm. The torn skin was raw, weeping fluid, and a tiny bead of blood. Dean walked over, his heavy boots crunching on the dirt she had missed. He didn't offer a word of sympathy. He reached into the deep pocket of his overalls, pulled out a roll of electrical tape, and tossed it. It hit her squarely in the chest. She fumbled, catching it before it hit the floor. "Wrap it," Dean said, "or it's going to get infected. Metal shavings in an open wound will rot your hand off by Tuesday." Camilla stared at the black tape. She ripped a piece off with her teeth, the adhesive tasting bitter and chemical, and clumsily bound her thumb. It was crude. It throbbed beneath the tight vinyl. Before she could pick the broom back up, a shadow fell over the open bay door. A battered Ford F-150 pulled into the lot, idling rough. A heavy-set man in a faded flannel shirt stepped out. He looked at Dean, then shot a confused, lingering look at Camilla, taking in her bruised face, the electrical tape on her hand, and the ruined designer clothes. "Got that alternator in, Dean?" the man asked, his voice booming over the rumble of his truck. "Yeah, Greg," Dean said, his posture shifting. The cold, hard edge he used with Camilla vanished, replaced by a weary professional compliance. "Bolted in yesterday. Replaced the serpentine belt, too. It was cracked down the middle." "I didn't authorize a belt," Greg said, his brow furrowing. He crossed his thick arms. "I said alternator. You trying to upcharge me, Miller?" Camilla watched Dean. She expected him to snap. She expected the same fierce, terrifying pride he had flashed at her. Instead, Dean just pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped his hands. He looked at the floor. Belt was $10 at cost, Greg. I didn't charge you labor on it. If it snapped on the highway, it would have taken your water pump with it. I was just trying to save you a tow. Greg snorted, pulling a battered leather wallet from his jeans. Whatever, just the alternator. $200, right? $220 with the part, Dean said quietly. Greg peeled 3 crumpled $100 bills, snatched his keys from Dean's hand, and expected his change. Dean walked to the office, grabbed a battered cash box, and handed Greg a faded 50 and a 10. Greg didn't leave a tip. He didn't say thank you. He just climbed into his Ford and drove away, the new alternator whining smoothly under the hood. Camilla stood by her pile of dirt. She felt sick. She had watched venture capitalists argue over tens of millions of dollars with less venom than that man had just used over a $10 piece of rubber. And Dean had just swallowed it. He had taken the insult, kept his head down, and took the money. Because he had to. The realization hit her like a physical weight. He has to eat this kind of dirt every single day. Dean walked back over, shoving the cash into his pocket. He looked at her, then at the broom. "Don't just stand there," Dean said, his voice flat. "The dirt doesn't walk itself to the dumpster." Camilla didn't argue. She didn't cry. She gripped the splintered wood with her taped hand, ignoring the searing pain, and started pushing the pile toward the back door. By 4 o'clock, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the greasy floor. The shop was quiet, save for the rhythmic metallic clicking of Dean's socket wrench as he tightened the suspension on a rusted sedan. Camilla was sitting on a plastic milk crate near the utility sink. Her legs felt like lead. Her lower back burned with a dull, persistent ache that no ergonomic office chair had ever prepared her for. She had swept the entire shop. She had carried 2 heavy trash bags to the rusted dumpster out back. Her white blouse was now a mottled canvas of gray dust, black oil, and dried sweat. The squeal of air brakes echoed from the street. A moment later, a heavy yellow school bus rumbled past the open bay doors. Dean stopped turning the wrench. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked toward the office. A minute later, a small figure appeared in the driveway. Toby was dragging a faded blue backpack, the straps adjusted as tight as they could go, but still hanging loose on his narrow shoulders. "Hey, bud," Dean said, catching the heavy door of the office and holding it open. "Hey, Dad," Toby mumbled. He walked into the shop, his sneakers scuffing the concrete. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Camilla sitting on the milk crate. He stared at her. She stared back. She didn't know how to look at children. Her life had been boardrooms, sterile laboratories, and high-altitude flights. Children were noisy variables she rarely encountered. "You're the lady from the rain," Toby said. His voice was high, clear, and entirely devoid of the cynicism his father carried. "Yes," Camilla said, her voice raspy. Toby tilted his head. "Why are you so dirty?" "Toby!" Dean warned sharply from the office doorway. "Leave her be. Go wash your hands. Macaroni in 10 minutes. Toby scampered toward the utility sink. Camilla had to stand up to get out of his way. She watched as the boy dragged a wooden step stool over to the sink, climbed up, and scrubbed his hands with the same harsh orange pumice soap his father used. The smell of the citrus solvent filled the air. 10 minutes later, Dean didn't tell her to leave. He just walked out of the office carrying 3 mismatched bowls. He set them down on the battered workbench, pushing aside a dismantled carburetor to make room. It was boxed macaroni and cheese, the cheap kind where the cheese powder never quite dissolved, leaving bright orange clumps clinging to the pale noodles. Sliced hot dogs were mixed in. Steam rose from the bowls, smelling of artificial cheddar and processed meat. Camilla hadn't eaten in 36 hours. Her stomach cramped so violently at the smell of the food that she had to grip the edge of the workbench to steady herself. Dean handed Toby a plastic spoon. He didn't hand one to Camilla. He just pointed at the 3rd bowl. "Eat," Dean said. Camilla picked up the bowl. It was hot against her palms. She found a metal spoon resting on a clean shop towel. She took a bite. It was salty. It was mushy. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She ate mechanically, swallowing the hot food so fast it burned her throat, her pride completely eradicated by pure biological necessity. They ate in silence. The only sound was the scraping of spoons against ceramic and the low hum of the refrigerator in the office. Halfway through the meal, Toby started to cough. It wasn't a throat-clearing cough. It was a deep, wet, rattling sound that seemed to originate from the very bottom of his lungs. He put his bowl down, his small chest heaving. The coughing fit worsened, turning his pale face a dark, flushed red. He gasped, his eyes watering, struggling to pull air through a suddenly narrowed airway. Dean dropped his spoon. He moved with practiced, terrifying speed. He didn't panic, but his jaw locked tight. He reached into his deep overall pocket, pulled out a blue plastic albuterol inhaler, and shook it violently. "Arms up, bud," Dean ordered quietly. Toby raised his arms, his chest juddering as he fought for breath. Dean placed the mouthpiece between the boy's lips. "Breathe out, now deep." Hiss! The sharp chemical sound of the aerosol deploying cut through the garage. Toby inhaled sharply, holding the medicine in his lungs. Dean counted silently on his fingers. 5, 6, 7. Toby exhaled. The rattling was still there, but the desperate edge of the choking subsided. Camilla sat frozen on her milk crate, her bowl of macaroni half empty. She stared at the blue plastic inhaler in Dean's hand. "I scrapped them at $15 a pound," Dean had told her last night, "to feed my kid, to buy his asthma medicine." The abstract numbers on her corporate spreadsheets suddenly crystallized into a brutal, suffocating reality. She had saved $4 million a year by dumping toxic, scorched metals in this exact room. Metals that off-gassed, metals that burned, metals that this little boy had been breathing the residue of for his entire life. She felt a wave of nausea, so intense she thought she might throw up the cheap food. She looked at Dean. He was stroking Toby's hair, his grease-stained hand startlingly gentle against the boy's forehead. He wasn't looking at Camilla. He wasn't blaming her in this moment. He was just surviving. Camilla set her bowl down on the workbench. Her taped thumb throbbed. She looked past Dean, past the boy, to the small, cluttered desk inside the office. She saw a stack of past-due envelopes, red ink stamped across the windows. She had built an empire by finding efficiencies, exploiting loopholes, and breaking systems down to their rawest parts. She was a monster, yes, but she was a brilliant one. She stood up. The nausea was still there, but a cold, hard clarity began to push through the fog of her exhaustion. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, smearing a streak of dirt across her cheek. "Where do you keep your ledger?" Camilla asked. Dean looked up from Toby, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What?" "Your books," Camilla said, her voice dropping the ragged, defeated tone. A sliver of the CEO returned, sharp and precise. "Your accounts payable, your vendor invoices. Where are they?" "In a shoebox under the desk," Dean said slowly. "Why?" "Because," Camilla said, walking toward the office door, "you're bleeding cash. I can see it from here, and I owe you rent for the floor." The shoebox smelled of mildew, stale tobacco, and desperation. It was a faded Nike box, the cardboard soft and peeling at the corners, held together by a single wrap of duct tape. Camilla dumped it onto the center of the sticky faux wood desk in the office. A mountain of crumpled, grease-stained paper spilled out, faded thermal receipts, handwritten invoices on yellow carbon paper, red-stamped final notices from the utility company. Dean stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the shop. His jaw was locked so tight, the muscle pulsed beneath his skin. He looked like a dog whose owner had just kicked his favorite bone out of reach. "Don't touch that," he warned. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of the weary patience he had shown Toby. Camilla didn't look up. She dragged the rolling office chair backward. The wheels shrieked against the linoleum. She sat down, her ruined slacks pressing into the cracked vinyl seat. You have a property tax installment due tomorrow. $3,200. You mentioned it when you were yelling at me. It's none of your business, Dean snapped. He took a step into the cramped office. The air instantly felt smaller. I handle my own problems. I don't need a bankrupt corporate suit treating me like a charity case. This isn't charity, Camilla said, her voice completely flat. She picked up a stack of crumpled receipts, flattening them out with her taped thumb. She winced at the pressure but didn't stop. This is rent. I took up your floor space. I drank your coffee. I ate your food. Now I am paying you for it. If you want to throw me out after this, fine, but sit down and shut up until I'm done. Dean stopped. He stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the woman was staggering. She was wearing clothes stiff with dried mud and his own engine grease. She had 40 cents to her name. Yet, sitting behind his battered metal desk, surrounded by peeling paint and the smell of old tires, she commanded the room with the terrifying authority of a predator that had just remembered it had teeth. He didn't sit down, but he didn't stop her either. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his thick arms over his chest. Camilla went to work. She didn't ask for a calculator. She didn't need one. Her eyes darted over the faded ink, her brain automatically categorizing, sorting, and calculating the raw data. She created 4 distinct piles: accounts payable, accounts receivable, operating expenses, debt servicing. For an hour, the only sounds in the office were the rapid rustle of paper and the heavy rhythmic ticking of a cheap plastic wall clock. Finally, she stopped. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. The dark circles under her eyes looked bruised in the harsh fluorescent light. "You're an idiot," she said quietly. Dean pushed off the doorframe, his temper flaring. "Excuse me?" "You're an idiot," Camilla repeated, dropping her hands and looking him dead in the eye. "You are an exceptional mechanic. The way you broke down that titanium block, it was precision work. But as a businessman, you are a complete and utter fool. You are hemorrhaging cash." She picked up a stack of invoices from the third pile. She held them up. They were printed with the logo for O'Reilly & Sons Auto Supply. "You buy all your replacement parts from these people," she said. "They're the only supplier in the county that delivers same day," Dean growled. "I need parts fast to turn the bays over." "They're charging you a 38% markup over standard wholesale," Camilla fired back, slamming the papers onto the desk. "Look at this line item. Rotors for a 2018 Ford Explorer. They charged you $140 a unit. The regional distributor price is $82. They know you're a small independent shop without a franchise backing, and they are bleeding you dry. I don't have the credit line for a direct distributor account," Dean said, his voice rising, defensive and raw. He hated this. He hated feeling small in his own shop. "My credit is shot from my ex-wife's medical bills. I take the terms I can get." "You don't take terms, you dictate them," Camilla said smoothly, leaning forward. The ghost of the billionaire CEO was fully present now. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You buy $20,000 of inventory from O'Reilly & Sons every year. You're keeping their local route profitable. If you pull your business, the driver loses his route. The regional manager loses his quarterly bonus." She tossed the O'Reilly invoices aside and picked up a single pink carbon copy. "And then there's this," she said. Her voice dropped, turning dangerously soft. "Your scrap dealer, a guy named Bert?" Dean shifted his weight. "Yeah, Bert. He brings the truck around." "Bert is a thief," Camilla said. "He gave you $400 for the last load. The receipt says it was 200 pounds of mixed aerospace alloy." $15 a pound, Dean said, his jaw tight. "That's standard for unsorted titanium." "It's not unsorted titanium," Camilla said. She stood up. She walked around the desk until she was standing inches from Dean. He could smell the stale coffee on her breath, mixed with the sharp scent of the citrus soap she had used. "It's grade 9 titanium alloyed with 3% aluminum and 2.5% vanadium. I know because I signed the purchase orders for the raw materials at Frost Dynamics. The spot market price for grade 9 isn't $15 a pound. It's $85. Dean stared at her. The numbers clicked into place in his head. The blood drained from his face. Bert owes you, Camilla whispered, her eyes locked on his. He owes you for 10 years of theft, and we are going to collect. The black plastic handset of the shop's landline phone was sticky with years of accumulated sweat and grease. Camilla held it to her ear, ignoring the grime. It was 8 a.m. on Friday. The property tax was due at 5 p.m. Dean stood by the coffee maker, a fresh mug of black tar in his hand. He watched her. He had expected her to break down again. He had expected her to cry or freeze. Instead, she was terrifyingly still. Her posture was perfectly straight, even though she was wearing a mechanic's oversized flannel shirt he had thrown at her earlier because her blouse was beyond saving. "O'Reilly and Sons, this is Greg," a tinny voice echoed from the receiver. "Greg, this is Camilla Frost, calling on behalf of Miller's Automotive," she said. Her voice was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was a voice designed to execute people in boardrooms. "Transfer me to your regional director, please." Look, lady, Miller's account is past due on—" "Greg?" Camilla interrupted, the single syllable cracking like a whip. "Do not speak to me about accounts. Transfer me to the regional director, or I will have Miller's Automotive terminate its vendor contract with O'Reilly and Sons by close of business today, and I will personally ensure your competitor across the county absorbs the entire annual spend. Do you want to be the reason your branch loses $20,000 in revenue on a Friday morning?" Silence hung on the line. Then a sharp click, followed by hold music. Dean took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't say a word. He just watched. 2 minutes later, a deeper, more confident voice picked up. "This is David, Regional Director. David, Camilla Frost, Miller's Automotive." She didn't pause for pleasantries. "I'm conducting a third-party audit of Mr. Miller's vendor relations. Upon reviewing your invoices for the past 36 months, I've noted a persistent 38% markup over standard wholesale, specifically targeting a disadvantaged independent contractor." "Now hold on," David started, his voice instantly defensive. "Mr. Miller's credit profile is entirely irrelevant to the predatory pricing structure you've implemented," Camilla cut in effortlessly. "You are utilizing a localized monopoly to artificially inflate margins. If this goes to a commercial dispute board, the discovery process alone will cost O'Reilly 3 times what you've squeezed out of this garage. But I am not interested in litigation, David. I am interested in efficiency." She leaned over the desk, her eyes fixed on a grease stain on the wall. "Here is what is going to happen," Camilla stated. "You are going to instantly retroactively apply a 20% discount to all inventory purchased in the last 90 days. You will issue a wire transfer for the overcharged amount, which I have calculated to be exactly $2,140, directly to Mr. Miller's operational account by noon today. Going forward, Miller's Automotive receives Tier 1 distributor pricing. Do we have an understanding?" "You can't just demand a retroactive—" "David!" Camilla's voice dropped to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "I have destroyed men with infinitely more power than a regional auto parts manager. Process the wire." She slammed the receiver down. The heavy plastic cracked against the cradle. She exhaled a short, sharp breath, her hands shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the sticky desk to steady them. She looked up at Dean. Dean lowered his coffee mug. A slow, incredulous smile crept onto his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his rugged, exhausted features into something dangerously sharp. $2,000, Dean asked. "It'll clear by noon," Camilla said, her chest heaving slightly. The adrenaline was hitting her system. "That covers the bulk of the tax, but we need more for operating capital." She picked up the receiver again. She didn't hesitate. She dialed the number from the pink carbon copy. "Bert Scrap," a gruff voice answered over the sound of crushing metal. "Bert, this is Dean Miller's financial proxy," Camilla said. She didn't use her name this time. Bert wouldn't care about a fallen CEO. Bert only cared about metal. I am looking at a receipt for 200 pounds of grade 9 aerospace titanium. You paid him $15 a pound. Yeah? Standard rate for dirty mixed scrap. Bert grunted. It wasn't mixed, and it wasn't dirty, Camilla said, her voice turning to ice. It was pure lab-tested alloy. The spot price is $85. You have been shortchanging this garage by $70 a pound for a decade. That is grand larceny, Bert. Listen here, lady, Bert growled, the hostility instantly spiking. I don't know who you think you are, but Dean takes what I offer. He ain't got the truck to haul it to the big yards in Cleveland. You're right, Camilla said smoothly. He doesn't, but I have the serial numbers of every experimental engine block you purchased from him, because they belong to Frost Dynamics, which means they are technically classified as restricted aerospace technology by the federal government. Dean choked on his coffee. He coughed, staring at her in absolute shock. Camilla didn't blink. If you don't have a truck in this lot within the hour, carrying $3,000 in cash as an adjustment fee for this month's load, I'm calling the FBI field office and reporting that a local scrap yard is illegally fencing restricted defense materials. How do you think an ATF raid will affect your daily operations, Bert? The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The background noise of the crushing metal seemed to fade. You're out of your mind, Bert whispered. Try me, Camilla said. She hung up the phone. She didn't slam it this time. She just set it down gently. She looked at her taped thumb, then up at Dean. The silence in the office was thick, heavy with the magnitude of what had just happened. The feds? Dean asked, his voice hushed. You'd call the feds? I don't even have a phone, Camilla said, a ghost of a smirk touching the corner of her mouth. But Bert doesn't know that. 50 minutes later, a rusted flatbed truck roared into the lot. A very pale, very quiet man stepped out, walked directly into the office, and slapped a thick manila envelope onto the desk. He didn't say a word. He just turned and practically ran back to his truck. Dean picked up the envelope. He tore the flap open. Inside, bound with rubber bands, was $3,000 in crisp, used bills. He stared at the money. It was more cash than he had held in his hands in 5 years. He looked across the office at Camilla. She was sitting in the rolling chair, her posture finally slumping, the terrifying energy draining out of her. She looked exhausted, bruised, and filthy. But as Dean looked at her, he didn't see the billionaire who had dumped trash on his lawn. He saw a shark that was finally swimming in his waters. The county clerk's office smelled like floor wax and old paper. The woman behind the thick plexiglass window didn't look up as Dean slid the manila envelope under the slot. She pulled the stacks of bills, ran them through an automated counter with a loud mechanical flutter, and stamped a red paid in full over his property tax statement. The heavy thud of that rubber stamp echoed in Dean's chest. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing, invisible weight that usually sat right behind his ribs lifted. When he pulled his truck back into the garage lot, the sky was bruising purple, signaling the end of the long Friday. The harsh shop lights were off. The only illumination came from the small desk lamp inside the office. Dean grabbed a brown paper bag from the passenger seat and walked into the shop. Camilla was sitting on the floor of the office, her back against the cheap wood paneling. Toby was sitting cross-legged across from her. Between them lay a deck of heavily creased playing cards. "Got any threes?" Toby asked, his voice completely serious. Camilla looked at her hand. She was wearing Dean's oversized flannel and a pair of gray sweatpants he had dug out of a gym bag. Her dark hair was tied back with a piece of electrical tape. She looked ridiculous. She looked entirely out of place. "Go fish," Camilla said. Toby sighed heavily and drew a card from the messy pile on the linoleum. Dean leaned against the doorframe. He rustled the brown paper bag. Camilla looked up, her dark eyes catching the yellow light of the desk lamp. She didn't look like a CEO anymore, but she didn't look like a stray dog either. The frantic, hollow panic from Thursday night was gone, replaced by a quiet, exhausted resignation. "Bedtime, bud," Dean said. Toby didn't argue. The albuterol had taken the edge off his breathing, leaving him drained. He gathered the cards, shoved them into the box, and climbed onto the worn-out sofa, pulling the moving blanket up to his chin. Dean jerked his head toward the open bay doors. Camilla stood up, her joints popping audibly, and followed him out into the massive, echoing space of the garage. The night air was cooling off, carrying the distant, continuous hum of the interstate. Dean walked over to his workbench, pulled 2 glass bottles of cheap domestic beer from the brown bag, and popped the caps off using the edge of a steel vise. He handed one to Camilla. She took it. The cold glass was slick with condensation. She didn't hesitate this time. She took a long drink. She didn't grimace at the watery taste. Dean sat on an overturned drywall bucket. Camilla leaned against the fender of the '94 Chevy. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was just heavy, filled with the sheer improbability of the last 24 hours. "The tax is paid," Dean said finally, staring out at the dark lot. "Account is flush. O'Reilly's driver dropped off a new batch of brake pads at 5 o'clock. Didn't say a word. Just left the invoice. 20% discount." "Good," Camilla said quietly. She traced the lip of her beer bottle with her taped thumb. "So," Dean said, turning his head to look at her. "What now? The feds froze your assets. The bank took your house. Your driver dumped you here. You saved my shop today, Camilla. But I can't put you up in a Ritz-Carlton." Camilla looked down at the concrete, the oil stains, the dirt she had swept. She took another drink of the beer, letting the cheap alcohol burn the back of her throat. "I don't have anywhere to go, Dean," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a strategic assessment. "If I walk out of here, I'm sleeping on a park bench. The federal indictment is going to take months to untangle. I am radioactive. Nobody in my old life will take my calls." She looked up, meeting his eyes. The predator was still there, lurking just behind her exhausted gaze. "But I know numbers," she said. "I know supply chains. I know how to find the blood in the stone. You are a brilliant mechanic, but you let this town walk all over you because you're too tired to fight back." Dean clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, but the $3,000 in his bank account argued louder. "You need a manager," Camilla stated. "You need someone to fight the vendors, collect the debts, and optimize your inventory. I need a roof. I need food. I need a place where the feds aren't looking." Dean laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "You want to work for me? A billionaire CEO doing the books at a struggling auto shop in Ohio?" "I want to survive," Camilla corrected him softly. "And right now, this garage is the only asset I have left." Dean stared at her. He thought about the past 10 years, the endless parade of silver flatbeds, the broken titanium dropped on his pavement. She had nearly ruined him with her arrogance. Now she was offering to save him with her desperation. He looked back at the office. Through the glass, he could see Toby sleeping deeply, his chest rising and falling without the harsh rattle. Dean took a final sip of his beer and set the empty bottle on the concrete. "There's an old cot in the storage room," Dean said, his voice gruff, devoid of any sentimentality. "It's drafty. The roof leaks when it rains. You sweep the floors, you handle the vendors, you do the taxes. I turn the wrenches." Camilla nodded slowly. She didn't smile. She just raised her bottle in a silent toast. "First thing Monday," Camilla said, her voice dropping into that terrifying, calculating register. "We audit your commercial insurance policy. I guarantee you're overpaying on your liability premiums." Dean shook his head, a genuine tired smirk crossing his face. "Drink your beer, Camilla. Tomorrow is a long day. Sometimes the universe breaks you down just to force you to rebuild." Dean and Camilla started as enemies separated by tinted glass and billions of dollars. But stripped of her wealth, Camilla found the one place her ruthless brilliance could actually help someone, and Dean finally found the weapon he needed to protect his son. Their partnership wasn't a fairy tale. It was built on grease, titanium, and sheer survival. What do you think of Camilla's redemption? Let me know in the comments below. If you love this story, like this video, share it, and hit subscribe for more incredible tales.